I must say the timekeeping today, I want to say the timekeeping has been Swiss, but I'm going to credit Wojtek, who is from Poland, in the front row. But yeah, bravo, Wojtek. You can, Poland is the new Switzerland. Yeah, I don't think Donald Tusk would agree with that. But anyway, but anyway, we're not here to talk about Poland or indeed Switzerland. We're here to talk about London and Londongrad. Now, I have the great privilege of being joined on stage by Joe Powell, MP. At the last election, I was terribly conflicted. Because a former colleague of mine was the incumbent Conservative MP, and Joe roundly thrashed her and ousted her. So, Joe, congratulations on your debut as an MP. I just asked you, how's it going? And you said, well, my constituents update me regularly. But how is it going?
Well, big question. There are a lot of new MPs in Parliament, so there's a generational shift. And I think that's interesting in terms of the culture. You know, I happen to be in West London, so I have a very different balance of things than MPs that are travelling constantly back to their constituencies. So we kind of have a tighter relationship with what's happening locally and here. But it's a big change. I was working in this field for 10, 11 years, and moving to this role is very different.
So when we first met, I thought you were the man from Currys, because you were trundling a washing machine around Kensington on what looked like a delivery trolley. Explain yourself.
So after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, we launched a local campaign called Kensington Against Dirty Money. So in the constituency I now represent, because Kensington and Chelsea, the borough, happen to have the second highest number of anonymous foreign-owned properties in the country. And we knew through the Panama and Paradise Papers and great work from OCCRP and other investigative reporters that 3 were owned by the president of Azerbaijan and his family in Holland Park. So we found a disused washing machine in a lock-up garage and took it on a trolley and stuffed it full of prop money of £50 notes and had 40 or 50 journalists from around the world there. And the point we were making was that it shouldn't have taken a second invasion of Ukraine to spark the interest there was in Parliament and in government. And to be fair to the previous government, they did pass 2 economic crime acts. And we were making the point that we should, at a minimum, we should know who owns and controls property in London. That's not the only solution, of course, but having that minimum level of transparency, and we still don't have it. So those properties owned by President Aliyev's family are in a trust called Quandu Finance, I think it's called, in the BVI. And if you look at the register of property that was created, it still doesn't say, Aliyev or Aliyev's family. It's an anonymous trust.
I remember reading once about sort of the number of lights in homes that don't go on in Kensington and Chelsea. So that's still a problem, is it?
Well, we have the most empty property in the country, and one of the things I'm always trying to do is make the issues that you would have been discussing today, try and connect them to the everyday concerns that my constituents or others have around the country. And I think the connection to the housing crisis, particularly in London, whether that's affordability, whether that's, I had a constituent that was evicted by an anonymous landlord based in Hong Kong, served a Section 21 notice, got them out, and doubled the rent and re-put it on the market. So it can be small individual cases like that can really change someone's life. And then the kind of big systemic issues around what I think are some very perverse incentives around new development in London, where we have huge new developments like 9 Elms, where a big chunk is sold off plan overseas. And that's not necessarily wrong per se, but we know that in that middle market range, this is not just the super oligarchs, right? It's the members of, the Chinese civil servants or whatever who want to stash their money in a safe security box because they don't know what's going to happen. And those properties often do remain empty, and the incentive even to let them is quite small. So it's making those connections, I think, between the big illicit finance problem and then the things that people worry about in their community that's so important to building wide support for this agenda.
So John Cusack was saying earlier on about how it's kind of important to remember, yes, precisely, sort of the on the ground issue. This is not just a a kind of macro issue to consider. Now, you said that you used to be in our world before you went into Parliament. You're the chair of the APPG on anti-corruption. You're filling some big shoes there. I don't want to call you the new Margaret Hodge, but you're filling some big shoes. But you also said, to be fair to the last government. So maybe you could just sort of give us an overview of what you think has been good over the last few years.
And it's important to mention the all-parliamentary group structure. These are cross-party. So my co-chair is Andrew Mitchell, the former Foreign Secretary, who in particular with Margaret led the charge on the overseas territories and crown dependencies and trying to get more transparency over company ownership registers there. And we have a Lib Dem co-chair as well. So we're one of the biggest all-parliamentary groups in Parliament, which is good. That shows us a lot of interest, especially from the new intake. And I think the way, if we just take from that second invasion of Ukraine, if you just take that last kind of, I guess, 3 years now, coming up to the third anniversary next week, there was more attention, I think, on this issue than there had been in the past. That's fair to say. Margaret had been banging the drum for years. Not to say that, David Cameron hosted an anti-corruption summit in 2016. We were the first country to have a public register of company ownership. So not to say that there wasn't progress before then. But I think the two economic crime acts were imperfect, but good steps forward. But they did leave a number of kind of unresolved issues where either there wasn't quite enough consensus to get it over the line, for example, on quite technical issues like why is trust-owned property exempted from the property register? That's 40% of foreign-owned property in Kensington and Chelsea. So they're quite technical things like that. I think the bigger picture things, like how do we take on this question of enablers in a way that is not in contest with the government's goals on economic growth and so on, that's kind of where we're at the moment. Like, what's the smart regulation that maintains Britain's competitive advantage in things like professional services, but also makes them less susceptible to dirty money and influence? I think that's kind of bigger picture where we are politically. But I'm very clear we want to try and build as much cross-party consensus as we can, because these things have to last multiple governments into the future. It can't just be a knee-jerk response.
So you mentioned Andrew Mitchell there from the Conservative Party, who, as you say, has been a long sort of campaigner and fellow traveller with Margaret Hodge when she was an MP. How do you see the sort of the status beyond Andrew Mitchell? How do you see sort of the status of the cross-party collaboration? Because I suppose we need to have sort of pressure for the government to make time for any new legislation that's needed and so on. So kind of where are we in the prioritisation of this issue and fixing some of the unresolved issues?
Well, I think the first thing is we have a Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, who has said it's his personal campaign to focus on kleptocracy. So that is a big opportunity. The second thing is they appointed Margaret as the anti-corruption champion. Now, people that know Margaret Hodge will know that she is not going to hold back in that role. She might be doing it more behind the scenes than we've been used to in the past. But you don't make a decision like that unless you're serious about trying to force some of, especially the cross-departmental working that's often been the weak point, right? Because the Foreign Office can lead on sanctions. That's really important. Welcome. We've got anti-corruption sanctions. There were some high-profile ones announced in December. But if you want to do something like serious reform to anti-money laundering supervision for the city, you obviously need to be doing that with the Treasury. And so that's the kind of, I think that's often been the weak point, is how do you get the cross-departmental working in Whitehall? And that's where Margaret will have a key role. So that's more on the implementation side of things that we can do with existing legislation. In terms of future legislation, I think the parliamentary time obviously is always contested, but I would love to see us take on the strategic litigation issue. So a comprehensive anti-slaps legislation, I think, would be a big step forward. That would need primary legislation. We do have it for economic crime. That was in the second Economic Crime Act, but we don't have it for other things. So we have to obviously make the case for that. And then, some of those kind of unfinished business, if you like around trust-owned property, you'd also need to find a vehicle. But there's a lot happening on the to-do list which we can do right now. And I think the other big piece that we'll have an opportunity in the next session, so the next King's Speech, will be an elections bill. And for obvious reasons, I think there's been a lot of focus on the vulnerabilities of our political parties to foreign influence and foreign money. So that is a kind of key one where I think right now the Electoral Commission and others have some ideas of how to do it. But certainly for people in this room, if you have kind of suggestions or loopholes that you think need to be closed, that's a really good opportunity.
And just on that, because we do, just on that, where is the thinking on that topic happening? Which ministry, and who do you talk to on that?
So the lead is the Ministry of Housing, Local Government and Communities. The reason for that is because elections are within that department. So there's a Minister for Democracy, Rushnara Ali, who is kind of leading the convening around this. The Electoral Commission have put forward 3 ideas. So one is around unincorporated associations. That's about, I think, Transparency International will correct me if I'm wrong, but £1 in 10, give or take. I can't see anyone from TI here. The second bit would be around UK companies and tying the cap on donations to UK company activity. That could be profits or turnover, but basically meaning you couldn't set a company up as a vehicle for to donate if you're not a British national. And then permissibility checks, so expanding those. So for example, unincorporated associations would have to run a check, like I would have to make sure it's a UK citizen and a permissible donor, which extraordinarily at the moment you don't have to do. So I would say those are more at the kind of fixing things at the margins proposals. Obviously there are kind of more radical suggestions like a cap on donations, which there are differing views on.
So you mentioned that the Foreign Office is responsible for sanctions. The Foreign Secretary, before the last election, made his speech on what he would do or what he wanted to do as relates to illicit finance. We had some anti-corruption sanctions recently. Of course, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine continues. We need to continue to focus our sanctions machinery on that. But what's your perspective on anti-corruption sanctions? I won't lead the witness. But in our sort of task force working on anti-corruption sanctions, they have been described by some as kind of presentational. Fair? Unfair?
Well, I think Isabel dos Santos is suing the British government, so it can't be entirely presentational. I think you need to use every tool that you have. I think we know, this problem is long enough in the tooth to know that there are no easy answers. And if you're using sanctions, at the same time that you're using things, that we know have been rarely used, like unexplained wealth orders, or you're, giving the National Crime Agency what they need to do enforcement cases. You're using tax law. Obviously, that was in the news in the last week or two with the Roman Abramovich case, where it would be hard to kind of make a case against Roman Abramovich, I think, on anti-corruption grounds, but on tax grounds, you might have firmer footing. I certainly hope HMRC take up that case. So I see it as, you've got to do all these things at the same time, and sanctions, I think, have a role in that. So it's certainly a useful tool, but in and of itself, on its own, obviously, it's not sufficient.
Talking of Roman Abramovich,
my former constituent, by the way.
Is his former football club still in your?
His mansion on Kensington Palace Gardens is a frozen asset, so you can visit that if you wish. His football club is slightly outside my constituency, but obviously one of the things that we've been asking the government to make progress on was the deal to sell Chelsea in the early stages of the conflict. £2.5 billion, there or thereabouts, is sitting in an escrow account. It has never been spent. That is 5 times what the UK has provided in humanitarian aid to Ukraine. And we still don't really understand why that has not been released or what the terms of the deal were. But that is a very significant amount of money in the context of the need in Ukraine. And we've got to get on with getting that money out the door.
So, last question. I think if I had £1 for every time a journalist from the other side of the English Channel has rung up and said, so, tell us about Londongrad, I would be challenging Mr. Abramovich when it comes to wealth. Where do you think we are then on the kind of, are we still Londongrad or some variation of that? What do we need to get done, let's say in the next 4 or 5 years, in order to become part of the solution rather than persistently part of the problem here in the UK?
Well, I think if you're looking at that time horizon, so beyond some of the kind of suggestions I've made on sort of specific smaller policy changes that I think could add up to something quite significant. David Lammy has talked about a summit of financial centres. What I would like to see is if this government could lead a coalition, notwithstanding obviously complexities of what's happening in the US, on what's the smart regulation for the enablers? Like what would it mean for people who want to do the right thing who are accountants, estate agents, working the banks, the PR agencies? I would use a broad definition of the term. But what would be the regime that allows them to thrive, allows it to thrive as a sector, a really important sector for the country, but also to avoid some of the abuse and handling of dirty money that we've seen. And I think the UK could be quite well placed to do that, given the centrality of London to the global financial system. And I think this summit of international financial centres, sometimes you need a kind of moment to organise around. So if that comes to fruition, which we hope it will, hopefully next year at some point, I think that could be a galvanising moment for getting into the specifics of what that kind of smarter anti-money laundering approach to professional services looks like. And then you start to shift, I think, the culture, which is always the hardest thing. And the analogy I would draw is the Bribery Act. The Bribery Act in 2010, if you look at the cases that the Bribery Act has led to, it's not that significant number, some very high-profile ones, but the shift in culture and business as a result of the Bribery Act has been very significant in my view. So I think you need an equivalent for money laundering and dirty money. Margaret would say you should have a failure to prevent money laundering and actually have some corporate liability. That would be great if we could get to it. That might be the kind of ambitious end of the scale.
Well, I recall driving at an entirely legal speed down the M3, talking to Sue Hawley about the idea of this International Financial Centre Summit. So we're certainly all in favour, and we'll do whatever we can to help bring that to pass. But look, Joe, on a busy day, thank you very much indeed for your time, and I say best of luck, and we're here to help.